The rain that never stopped. That nightfall, the rain began without warning. A heavy downpour that appeared to silence the entire planet. Perched beside the window, Lucy observed the rivers running down the pane. She enjoyed the rain. She usually found it to be soothing, but this storm was unique. It seemed weighty, even stifling, as though the heavens themselves were trying to crush the ground below. The rain got stronger as midnight drew near, and she saw a black man peering squarely at her window across the street. She originally assumed it was simply someone trapped in the rain. The head of the shadow was slightly bowed. It was hardly discernible through the water sheets. Still, the figure remained motionless even as lightning shot across the heavens, casting its hollow, soulless eyes on display. Lucy shivered down her spine and drew the curtains fast. Still, the constant sense of observation stayed at the back of her consciousness. Turning on the TV tried to help her focus, but the image of the figure stayed carved in her head. She heard, suddenly, a dripping sound. Not from outside but from within her house. She turned down the TV and listened very carefully. The sound was steady, every drop echoing like a far-off pulse. Following the commotion into the hall, she discovered water gathering at the foot of her steps. Her heart hammered as she raised her head to find a black, wet imprint on the ceiling, as though something were leaking through. Lucy heard the smallest whisper carried by the expanding stain. She hurried up the stairs to discover her bedroom door open and a steady leak emanating from inside. She pushed the door open and saw the figure, now standing at the foot of her bed, now into her house. Its eyes were empty pits, and the downpour appeared to soak her room from right within. It opened its mouth, and Lucy heard a whisper. A single word that kept returning in her head, "Join." Lucy retreated, her feet sliding on the damp floor, till she collapsed and struck her head squarely against the wall. The world was blurring. The last thing she saw was the figure slowly approaching her with a hand. Her eyesight darkened as the outside rain persisted unrelenting. Lucy woke up in a fog with headaches. The person had disappeared, but she lay on her bedroom floor, and the room remained soaked. Her body hurting, she managed to sit up and look around. Outside, the rain was still falling, and the dripping sound had grown nearly loud. Pulling herself up using the side of her bed for support, she saw something on the floor, a trail of damp footprints heading from her room. Following the footprints down the corridor, her heart surged. They produced the somewhat ajar attic door. Every instinct told Lucy to turn around and sprint, but something pulled her ahead instead. She pulled the door open more widely and extended a quivering hand. As she climbed, the attic steps creaked. Each step felt like weight pushing down her chest. The only light in the gloomy attic came from a little window where the rain hammered against the glass. She spotted someone slumped in the corner, back to her. Lucy could hear a faint, moist crying from hunched over. Her voice was hardly a whisper as she whispered, "Hello?" She felt a mixture of pity and terror. The man stopped crying. Its head turned gently toward her. Lucy's breath seized in her throat when she saw her own face, twisted in agony, eyes lifeless and soulless. The doppelganger opened its mouth, and the identical whisper resounded through the attic. "Join." Lucy stumbled off her feet as the attic window cracked suddenly and a blast of wind and rain swept in. Her eyes never leaving the figure, she scrambled backwards. Its motions were jerky and strange. It started to creep toward her, leaving a trail of water in its wake. Lucy felt a chilly, damp hand seize her ankle when her back struck the wall. Her power came from a panic attack, allowing her to kick free. Turning, she ran down the attic steps, almost stumbling in her hurry. Running across the hall, the dripping sound became a symphony resonating from every wall. She could sense the presence behind her, unrelenting, as though the house itself were alive and attempting to drag her back. Lucy arrived at the front door, her hands clumsy with the lock. The door seemed bloated from the wetness and locked. Her fingers slid as she grabbed at it furiously. She heard behind her the whisper becoming louder, almost like a chant now. "Join. Join." Lucy staggered into the downpour as the door swung open with a last, desperate pull. She raced, not looking back, when the chilly rain struck her face. Though they were fading under the weight of the pounding rain, she could still hear the whispers. Breath came in jerky gasps as she ran till her legs gave out and collapsed on the damp ground. She turned back toward her house, now but a silhouette in the storm, as the rain swept over her. She knew the story was far from finished, even if the man had disappeared. Something the rain brought would not let her leave. Lucy woke up the following morning to a brilliant, dry day. The rain had ceased, and her bedroom window let in the brightness. Though the dampness of her sheets and the faint echo of a voice in her head contradicted her almost belief that it had been a dream. She attempted to go about her daily business, but the air was tense, and she felt it clinging to her. Dark clouds started to gather as dusk arrived, and the first droplets of rain sprayed on her window. Lucy felt her pulse drop. She watched as the sky darkened and the rain grew more intense. Closing all the curtains, she sought to block out the storm, but the sound of the rain seemed to penetrate through the walls and reverberate in her ears. She nearly lost in the sound of the downpour the tiniest whisper. Join. With shaken palms, Lucy reached for her phone. She prayed her best friend would answer when she dialed her number. The line rang once, twice, then there was stillness. A chilly voice emerged from the interference, hardly perceptible. "You can't escape." Heart racing, Lucy dropped the phone. She turned aside, her eyes flying about the space. The walls shimmered, the shadows darkening as though something were moving within them. The lights flickered, and the power went out abruptly. Lucy sank into darkness with the flashes of lightning outside as the sole source of illumination. She could sense the chilly, damp sensation returning, almost here. Her hands outstretched in the darkness, she staggered toward the door. But now she could hear the whisper everywhere. "Join," she shouted, pushing through the door and racing down the corridor when something cool brushed her arm. The house turned about her, the walls moving as though they were alive. She could see creatures rising out of the shadows, their hollow eyes riveted on her. While the murmur became louder, nearly deafening, the rain had now entered, pouring water from the ceiling and soaking the flooring. With shaky hands, Lucy struggled to unlock the front door. The lock seized. The door would not move. She could sense the figures closing in, their frigidity rubbing against her. She turned, her back against the door, and saw hundreds of them, their hollow eyes fixed at her, their features contorted in suffering. They started to speak, and the whisper grew to be a roar. "Join us!" Lucy launched herself against the door with a last surge of power, and it sprang open. She staggered outdoors, the chilly rain slapping her cheeks, her bare feet splashing across the puddles. The murmurs vanished behind her. She ran. Her breath came in sobs as she collapsed on the pavement at the end of the street. She stopped then. She turned back toward her house, the dark form just perceptible through the rain. She knew even if they had vanished, the forms were still there, waiting. Rain brought them. They never left. Lucy knew she had to keep fleeing. She could never go back. Yet, deep down, she felt the pull, the voice that she would never really leave her. Join. The passenger in the rain. He picked up a passenger on a rainy night. But what he didn't realize was that the passenger had been waiting for him for years. James, a cab driver, approached her as she stood by the side of the road on a dark, soggy night. Her clothing clung to her, as if she had spent hours out in the storm. James almost passed, but he stopped at something in her gaze. He stopped, and she slipped quietly into the back seat. She delivered an address in an area James wasn't familiar with, her voice scarcely a whisper. As he drove, the rain hammered on the automobile. The windshield wipers battled to keep up. He tried to strike conversation by looking at the rearview mirror, but she just stared out the window. Her face was white, her eyes sunken, and James felt an odd cold even with the car's warmth. Despite his efforts to focus on the road, his skin tingled in her presence. Once again, he gazed up into the glass and noticed something unusual. Her reflection was disappearing. She seemed to be breaking apart in the darkness. James began to panic and gently swiveled the car, looking back to ensure she was still there. She looked back in the mirror, and for a minute, her mouth opened in a silent scream, and her face contorted into something strange. With his heart racing, James slammed on the brakes and whirled around, but the back seat was empty. As he discovered the door was open, and there were damp footsteps heading away into the dark. Rain poured inside the car. James shook, then glanced back toward the road, only to find that the street had undergone a transformation. The houses seemed deserted, as if he had journeyed into a different era, and the road signs had aged and faded. She had handed him an address straight ahead. When James saw it, a crumbling house with broken windows, the same one he had seen in the news years ago, where a young woman had been discovered following a fatal accident, his blood raced cold. Again, he heard her whisper from right next to him, "You finally brought me home." James's hands gripped the driving wheel with white knuckles. He sensed someone else next to him as the car's air cooled. He turned slowly, and her empty eyes locked on him from the passenger seat. Her lips opened, and she said, "You can't leave yet." James felt panic flood through him. In an attempt to escape the house, he pressed down on the gas pedal, causing the tires to skid on the damp road. Despite the distance he traveled, the landscape remained unchanged. He found himself ensnared in a loop, surrounded by the same dilapidated houses and antiquated road signs. The woman remained beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her presence oppressive. The rain increased, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up. James's vision became hazy, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly. Her voice, a gentle and eerie lullaby, continued to repeat in his mind. She said, "You can't escape. You must stay now. You brought me home." Realizing the truth, he was no longer in control. James's heart surged. The car was running itself, the wheel spinning beneath his hands. Though his arms felt weak and his body felt numb, he fought to fight it. The automobile veered down a small, overgrown road into the gloom. The home loomed ahead of him, its windows staring at him like vacant eyes. The engine died as the car stopped before the house. She turned to face James, her face inches from his. Her eyes were empty, as if they could swallow him whole. She said, "Come inside," and her voice reverberated in his head. "It's time." The car door opened on its own, dragging James out against his will. He staggered toward the house, the woman's frigid hand clutching his, the rain soaking him. James followed the creaking open door inside. The walls seemed to throb with life of their own, and the air smelled of decay. The woman guided him to a room in the rear of the home. It was dark, the sole illumination being a flickering candle on a little table. The woman pushed James into a chair in the middle of the room. Standing over him, the woman had a blank face. She continued, "You brought me home," her voice no longer a whisper but rather a commanding force. "You now need to stay." James felt a chill seep into his bones as the flickering flame changed. The figure started to disappear. Her body melted into the darkness, but her presence stayed. The gloom pressed against him as the walls seemed to shut in. James tried to move, to yell, but his voice vanished and his body froze. Her whisper, resonating over the house, "Welcome home," was the last he heard. James awoke to the sound of rain falling. He remained in the chair, the candle reduced to a mere stub, its flame barely flickering. The room was empty. The woman had left, yet her presence persisted. Though his body was rigid and his muscles hurt, he struggled to move. James could hear the weakest whisper in the distance as the rain outside hammered against the glass. With his legs wobbling, he stood and staggered toward the door. The house was gloomy. Mold coated the walls. The floorboards creaked with his weight. Heart thumping, he headed toward the front door. He had to get out of this dream. But the door flew open on its own as he grabbed for the handle, exposing the woman standing there. Her mouth turned into a grin, but her eyes were empty. "You can't leave," she murmured, her voice resounding in his head. "You're home now." James backed off, his heart pounding. The woman entered. The door closed behind her. The chamber got colder, and the air smelled like decay. James could sense the walls closing in and the gloom smothering him. His feet slipped on the damp floor as he turned and fled, but the house seemed to whirl around him, the walls moving and the doors guiding him back to the same room. The woman was constantly there, her empty eyes tracking him, her presence stifling. James knew he was caught. The rain never stopped, and the whispers never stopped. The house had grabbed him. There was no escape. Her gentle, frigid voice, "Welcome home, James," was the last thing he heard as the darkness took him. Cry of the crystal of the rain. It was one of those October evenings in rural Pennsylvania when the rain fell relentlessly, as if the heavens were mourning a loss. Jessica drove down the small back roads for nearly an hour as darkness engulfed her like a living entity. Her windshield wipers hardly kept up with the downpour. Therefore, the tall trees on either side of the road looked to swing and turn under the low light of her headlights. She was tired, exhausted actually, but eager to reach her sister's cabin before morning. Though the burial had emotionally worn her out, the peace she sought always came from the silence of the woods. She turned again, and the rain banged more loudly on the roof. She squinted, peering above the hazy mist for any sign of the driveway leading to the cabin. She then started to see it. Beside the road was someone seated. She first thought of it as a trick of the rain, a shadow created by a tree maybe, but as she approached, the form became clearer. The woman's clothes hung to her like she had spent hours in the rain, covering her head to toe. Her hair hung thick, dark strands over her face, yet her posture appeared strange. Jessica's heart thumped more rapidly. She slowed the car by lowering down the window just a notch. She yells, "Are you okay?" Her words nearly carried above the pounding rain. The woman moved nowhere or answered nothing. Jessica hesitated, her senses screaming at her to leave that area. She is driving. However, the woman's stillness had a disquieting quality that tormented her conscience. Jessica reluctantly parked the car in the park, grabbed her flashlight, and headed for the storm. The rain, colder than she had expected, bit her skin as she moved nearer the woman. The ground beneath her was uneven and sticky. Her boots hung in the sludge. She waved the spotlight, intent on drawing the woman in. "Do you need help?" she once again inquired. Finally, the woman lifted her head gently. Her eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed on Jessica's, and for a moment, she felt as if she couldn't breathe. Despite her eyes appearing lifeless, they were perceiving something genuinely terrifying. Something needs to be updated. She felt a cold crawl back. The woman said, "Please." Her voice was just audible above the wind, raspy and weak. "Please help me find him." With fear tingling at the edge of her awareness, Jessica retreated. Her voice was trembling. "Who?" she said. "My son," the mother said, eyes never wavering. "I'm not sure where he is." Jessica's heart fell. The words hung heavy in the air, causing her heart to veer towards panic. The rain seemed louder, more aggressive, as though the guard alerted her to leave. Here, something needed to be corrected. Jessica stammered and turned toward her car, adding, "I don't think I can help." Rising to her feet, the lady moved stiffly and unnaturally. She begged. Her voice got louder. "He is currently situated in the woods. He seems chilly. His eyes are wet. You owe me something for helping." Jessica lurched back, her hands sliding on the wet car door handle. She felt a surge of terror course through her body. She shut the door straight away after pulling it open and leapt inside. She dared not glance around, and her hands trembled as she struggled to start the engine. The engine roared to life, and as she prepared to take off, something smashed through the passenger window. Jessica yelled out. The woman pressed her face against the glass, her dead eyes wide and filled with dreadful anger. She said, "Find him." Her voice seemed strange now, high-pitched and alien. "You have to look for him." Without thought, Jessica ground the pedal. The tire swirled in the muck before it caught, and the car shot ahead. As long as she was on her way, her goal didn't matter. The road was a whirl of rain and darkness. Her heart thumped so wildly it felt like it might explode. She glanced in the rearview mirror just as the rain, miles away, began to brighten. Her exhale lingered in her throat. The woman, barely visible in the distance, stood at the edge of the road, watching. She was not, nonetheless, alone. Beside her was a tiny man, immobile and covered with dashes. Jessica furiously applied the brakes as her mind raced. She blinked, then looked again, only to see the mother and child vanish. She stayed there for a long time. The rain gently tapped the windows now, and her breath ragged. Inside the car, the air seemed stifling, loaded with dread and something else. Something worse. Jessica never talked about that evening but never drove those paths again. Not even during the day. She thinks she can still hear them occasionally in the dark of night when the rain falls just right. The faint sound of a child sobbing in the distance, lost in the woods, always screaming for someone to find him. Put RA in writing. The cry of the rain's crystal. For the United States, this narrative tells a frightening story or a nighttime fear. Adds sentiments and suspense.